What would a man do if, in the cruelest place human evil has ever created, he were given the chance to die so that someone else might live? In the Auschwitz extermination camp, a Franciscan priest stepped forward and spoke words that still send shivers down the spine. "I will go in his place." He offered to starve to death to save a family man, a stranger, and descended into a death bunker, transforming it through his prayers and hymns into a threshold of heaven. That man was Maximilian Maria Kolbe, deeply in love with the Immaculate Virgin, a tireless apostle and, in the end, a martyr of charity. Let us follow his life, from a humble village in Poland to the supreme sacrifice at Auschwitz, and discover that, as he used to say, only love creates. Before we begin, tell us in the comments which city or country you are joining us from today. It brings us joy to know how far devotion to Saint Maximilian Kolbe reaches. And if you carry any intention in your heart, an act of generous self-offering, a consecration to the Virgin, the victory of love over hatred in your life, leave it in the comments as your prayer request as well. Let us place all these intentions together under the protection of this great martyr of charity. If this story strengthens your faith, stay with us until the end. Chapter 1. Poland, 1894. The Child of the Two Crowns. On January 8, 1894, a boy was born in the small town of Zdunska Wola, Poland. His parents named him Raymond. His family was humble and hard-working, but rich in faith, simple, devout people who raised their children to love God and the Virgin Mary. Poland was going through difficult times, divided and occupied by foreign powers. But in that Christian home, the faith remained alive, a faith that would become little Raymond's greatest treasure. From childhood, he displayed an intense piety, joined to a lively and sometimes mischievous nature. He loved the Virgin Mary with a tender, trusting love and turned to her in everything. Tradition preserves an episode that he would later recount himself, one that shaped his entire life. As a child, worried about his future, he prayed to the Virgin and asked her what would become of him. According to his account, the Mother of God appeared to him and showed him two crowns, one white and one red. The white crown represented purity, a life of holiness and perseverance. The red crown represented martyrdom, the giving of one's life for Christ. The Virgin asked him which of the two he wanted. And little Raymond, with the generosity of a great soul, replied that he wanted both. He wanted to be pure, and he wanted to be a martyr. That childhood response proved to be like a prophecy of his entire life, for God granted him both crowns. Whatever the precise details of that experience, which he passed on as a cherished memory, it certainly expresses Kolbe's soul. His love for the Immaculate Virgin and his desire to give himself entirely to God, even to martyrdom if necessary. From childhood, his heart was oriented toward those two goals, the holiness and offering of his life that would be fulfilled in an extraordinary way at the end of his days in Auschwitz. Raymond grew up in that atmosphere of faith and love for Mary, feeling ever more strongly the call to consecrate himself to God. He did not want a comfortable or mediocre life, but to give himself entirely to the Lord and the Virgin and to work for the salvation of souls. That desire led him, while he was still young, to knock on the doors of a religious order, ready to leave everything behind to follow Christ beneath the mantle of the Immaculate. Thus, the Child of the Two Crowns took the first step toward fulfilling his vocation. He entered religious life, changed his name, and began a journey that would lead him to become one of the great apostles of his time, and, in the end, a martyr of charity. Let us see how Raymond became Brother Maximilian, a Franciscan deeply in love with the Immaculate Virgin. Chapter 2. Franciscan and Apostle of the Immaculate. As a young man, Raymond entered the Franciscan order in the branch of the conventual Franciscans, drawn by the ideal of St. Francis of Assisi, poverty, humility, and love for Christ and his Church. When he donned the religious habit, he left behind his former name and took the name Maximilian. Later, he would add the name Mary, so dear to him, becoming Maximilian Mary, to express his total belonging to the Virgin. Very soon, his brilliant intelligence and deep piety became evident. Sent to study in Rome, the very heart of Christianity, he studied philosophy and theology there with great distinction, earning doctorates in both disciplines. He was a young man of exceptional gifts, who could have distinguished himself in the world of learning, but he placed all his knowledge at the service of one single cause, to make God known and loved through the Immaculate Virgin. For the center of Maximilian's life was always the Virgin Mary, and especially under the title of the Immaculate Conception. He was convinced that Mary is the surest and sweetest way to reach Christ, and that consecrating oneself entirely to her is the best way to belong to God. He made that total consecration to the Immaculate the program of his entire life and apostolate. He wanted to be an instrument in her hands. He often recalled what the Virgin herself had said of herself at Lourdes to Saint Bernadette, "I am the Immaculate Conception." That mystery of Mary, conceived without sin, full of grace, entirely belonging to God, captivated Maximilian. He saw in the Immaculate the woman who crushes the head of the serpent, the victor over all heresies and every evil, and he wanted to place himself completely at her service for the conversion of the whole world. For Maximilian, the Immaculate was not a sentimental devotion, but the surest way to reach Christ. He taught that whoever places himself in Mary's hands, the mother Jesus gave us from the cross, when he said, "Behold your mother," John 19:27, cannot be lost, because she always leads us to her Son. That is why he invited everyone to consecrate themselves to the Virgin without reserve, certain that in her hands they would be better protected than in their own. An immense desire burned in his heart to win the whole world for Christ through the Immaculate. He was not content with little. He dreamed of bringing every soul to God, beginning with those who were furthest away, the sinners and the enemies of the Church. That apostolic zeal, joined to his love for Mary, would give rise to a great work, born when Maximilian was still a young student in Rome. Let us learn about that work, the Militia of the Immaculate. Chapter 3, the Militia of the Immaculate. While still in Rome, as a young religious, Maximilian conceived and launched the work that would become the foundation of his entire apostolate. In 1917, together with several companions, he founded the Militia of the Immaculate, a spiritual movement whose purpose was total consecration to the Immaculate Virgin Mary for the conversion of sinners and the enemies of the Church, and the sanctification of all under her protection. The idea was simple and at the same time bold. It meant offering oneself entirely to the Virgin, allowing oneself to be used by her as a docile instrument so that through her many souls might be converted and returned to God. The members of the militia consecrated themselves to the Immaculate, placed themselves under her mantle, prayed for the conversion of sinners, even the most hardened, and worked by every lawful means to spread the kingdom of Christ. His motto was to win the whole world for God through Mary. Maximilian had a universal heart. He excluded no one from his apostolic zeal. On the contrary, he showed particular concern for those who were most distant from and hostile to the faith, convinced that the Virgin could touch and convert even the hardest heart. He prayed and urged others to pray for the enemies of the Church, not with hatred, but with love, desiring their salvation. In this, he showed himself faithful to the gospel, which commands us to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. That boundless confidence in Mary's intercession gave Maximilian an uncommon apostolic boldness. He could not resign himself to the loss of souls. He wanted to reach them all, and for this he was prepared to use every means and expend all his strength. The militia of the Immaculata became the channel for that zeal, and in time it would spread through many countries, bringing together multitudes of the faithful consecrated to the Blessed Virgin. That work, born in the heart of a young religious, was only the beginning. Maximilian dreamed of bringing the message of the Immaculata to the whole world, using not only prayer, but also the modern means of communication that were beginning to transform society. Now ordained a priest, he was about to launch into an astonishing apostolic activity, placing the printing press and technology at the service of the gospel. Let us take a look. Chapter 4. Priest and Evangelizer through Modern Media. In 1918, Maximilian was ordained a priest in Rome. Celebrating Holy Mass and bringing Christ to souls became the center of his life. Soon afterward, he returned to his homeland, Poland, determined to spread the love of the Immaculata and bring about the conversion of souls by every available means. With remarkable insight for his time, he understood that the press and modern means of communication could be enormously powerful instruments of evangelization. With boldness and trust in providence, and despite his health, which was constantly weakened by the tuberculosis he suffered from, Maximilian founded a magazine devoted to the Blessed Virgin, entitled The Night of the Immaculata. It began very modestly, with scarcely any resources, but with immense faith. And that publication continued to grow until it reached astonishing circulations of hundreds of thousands, and even more than 1 million copies, spreading the message of faith and love for Mary throughout Poland and beyond. He did not stop there. Maximilian wanted to place every means offered by modern technology at the service of the gospel. The printing press, publications, and even plans for radio and other new developments. He understood that if the world used those means to spread error and evil, Christians had to use them with even greater zeal to spread truth and goodness. In this sense, he was a pioneer of what we would now call evangelization through the media. Behind all that activity, there was no desire for success or recognition, but one single desire: the salvation of souls and the glory of God through the Immaculata. Maximilian did not seek his own name, but Mary's and Christ's. He worked tirelessly, with a dedication that amazed those around him, spending his limited strength on the cause that was his whole life. In him, technology and organization were placed at the service of love. He often used a phrase that sums up his spirit: "Only love creates." He was convinced that only love truly builds, and that without love, all activity is sterile. That is why, in all his undertakings, he put love for God, the Blessed Virgin, and souls first, certain that this love was the force that made everything fruitful. With this spirit, he was about to undertake ever greater works. To channel that apostolic activity, Maximilian founded a place that would become the heart of all his work, a kind of city entirely consecrated to the Blessed Virgin. But before telling the story of that city of the Immaculata, let us pause at an astonishing stage of his life when his zeal carried him to the other side of the world, his mission in faraway Japan. Let's take a look. Chapter 5. Missionary in Japan. Maximilian's apostolic zeal knew no boundaries. It was not enough for him to evangelize his homeland. He wanted to carry love for the Immaculate Virgin to the ends of the earth. And so, around 1930, with a handful of companions and almost no resources, he embarked on a daring mission to faraway Japan, a country with an ancient culture where Christians were a very small minority. As always, he went, entrusting everything to Providence and the Virgin Mary. Upon arriving in the city of Nagasaki, Maximilian immediately set to work. He learned the language, built relationships with the people, and in a very short time began publishing a Japanese edition of his magazine, The Night of the Immaculate, to spread the faith among that people. He also founded a friary and an apostolic center, which he named the Garden of the Immaculate, from which love for Mary and the message of the gospel could radiate. An astonishing detail surrounds that foundation. Maximilian decided to build the friary not in the center of the city, as would have seemed most logical, but on the slope of a mountain, in a remote place that some considered impractical. Years later, when an atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki in 1945, that friary, shielded by the mountain, was largely spared the devastation. Many saw in this a sign of the Immaculate's protection over the house that had been consecrated to her. That missionary adventure reveals just how deeply Maximilian trusted in Providence. He set out with scarcely any means to a country whose language he did not know, confident that the Immaculate would provide whatever was necessary. And indeed, the work flourished beyond all human expectation. His life is proof that those who trust in God and work with all their strength for His kingdom are not disappointed, even when their undertakings seem impossible in the eyes of the world. That mission in Japan shows the breadth of Maximilian's heart and his limitless trust in God. He undertook works that seemed humanly impossible, founding institutions in distant lands without money and without knowing the language, and brought them to fruition through the strength of faith and love. He did not allow difficulties or his poor health to stop him. Instead, he threw himself into the conquest of souls, wherever Providence led him. After several years of intense work in the East, Maximilian's failing health and the needs of his work in Poland forced him to return to his homeland. He left behind in Japan a seed that would continue to bear fruit, and returned to devote himself fully to the great work he had founded near Warsaw. We devote the next chapter to that city of the Immaculate, which was like the apple of his eye. Chapter 6. The City of the Immaculate. Back in Poland, Maximilian devoted himself to developing the great work he had founded near Warsaw. A friary and apostolic center he named Niepokalanów, which means City of the Immaculate. It was a place entirely consecrated to the Virgin, conceived as a great factory of goodness, from which love for Mary and the gospel of Christ could be spread by every possible means. That City of the Immaculate grew into a vast friary, one of the largest in the world, inhabited by hundreds of friars. The religious lived and worked there in the strictest poverty and an intense life of prayer, dedicated to printing and distributing Catholic publications, as well as to other apostolic tasks. Everything was organized with order and efficiency, but animated by a supernatural spirit. Every task was an act of love for God and the Virgin. Maximilian governed that great community not as a leader, but as a father and a brother. He himself lived in the greatest poverty, shared his friars' hardships, and guided them above all by the example of his dedication and piety. Despite his authority, he was humble, approachable, and kind, and his religious loved and venerated him as a saint. Under his guidance, Niepokalanów became a home of holiness and a center of apostolic work whose influence spread throughout Poland. At the heart of all that activity was always the Immaculate Virgin. Saint Maximilian wanted Niepokalanów to belong entirely to her, and for everything done there to serve her cause and the salvation of souls. He repeatedly urged his friars to let the Immaculate use them as her instruments, seeking not themselves, but only the glory of God. That spirit of total consecration gave the work an admirable fruitfulness. Niepokalanów came to be known throughout Poland as a place of faith and work, where the silence of prayer was joined to the noise of the printing presses, and where hundreds of friars lived poor but happy, united by one shared ideal. In a certain sense, it was a foretaste of what the world can be when God is placed at its center, a place of fraternity, sanctified work, and peace. But increasingly dark clouds were gathering over Poland and the whole world. The peacetime years in which Saint Maximilian had built his work were coming to an end, and one of the greatest catastrophes in history was approaching, the Second World War. That war would put Saint Maximilian and his work to the test and lead him along paths of suffering to the supreme sacrifice. Let us see how the war burst into the life of the City of the Immaculate. Chapter 7. The War and the Refuge for the Persecuted. In 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, beginning the Second World War. A brutal occupation descended upon the country, marked by persecution, violence, and terror. The Polish Catholic Church was persecuted, many priests and religious were arrested, and Saint Maximilian's work was gravely threatened. A time of trial and danger was beginning for him and his friars. Amid that tragedy, Saint Maximilian did not think of seeking safety for himself, but of helping those who were suffering. The City of the Immaculate opened its doors to welcome multitudes of refugees fleeing the war, including many Jews persecuted by the Nazis. Thousands of people found food, shelter, and consolation in Niepokalanów. Saint Maximilian and his friars shared with them the little they had, risking their own safety out of love for their brothers and sisters in need. That charity toward the persecuted, and especially toward the Jews, was an act of courage at a time when helping them could cost a person his life. But Saint Maximilian made no distinction of race or religion. He saw a brother in every persecuted person and, in that person, Christ himself. In the most difficult circumstances, he thus fulfilled the commandment of love, welcoming the stranger and the persecuted as the gospel commands. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. Matthew 25:35. At the same time, Saint Maximilian sought to continue his apostolate as far as possible, publishing writings that sustained the faith and hope of the people and refused to submit to the regime's lies. That fidelity to the truth, together with his welcome of the persecuted, made him an inconvenient and dangerous man in the eyes of the occupiers. He knew he was putting himself at risk, but he did not cease to do good or to bear witness to the truth. As might be expected, the persecution eventually caught up with him. The Nazi authorities, who saw him as an enemy because of his influence, his faith, and his charity toward the persecuted, decided to arrest him. Saint Maximilian was taken into custody, and the final and most painful stage of his life began, a stage that would lead him along the way of the cross to the supreme sacrifice. Let us contemplate with reverence his arrest and his arrival at Auschwitz. Chapter 8. Arrest and Auschwitz. In 1941, Maximilian was arrested by the Nazi secret police, the Gestapo, and imprisoned. Shortly afterward, he was transferred to the Auschwitz concentration and extermination camp, one of the most terrible places ever created by human evil, where an uncountable multitude of people were atrociously murdered, most of them Jews, but also many Poles and prisoners from other nations. Maximilian entered as just another number, stripped of everything. He was prisoner number 1C670. In that hell of cruelty, hunger, exhausting labor, and death, where everything was designed to destroy not only the prisoners' bodies, but also their dignity and souls, Maximilian remained steadfast in his faith and charity. Far from sinking into the despair or selfishness that the struggle for survival often provoked, he continued to be a priest and a father, bringing God's consolation to others amid that horror. Despite being forbidden and extremely dangerous, Maximilian secretly carried out his priestly ministry. He listened to the prisoners, encouraged them, strengthened them in the faith, prayed with them and for them. He shared his meager ration of food with the weakest, gave up his place, and comforted those in despair. In a place where everyone struggled to survive, he thought of others, sowing love where hatred and death reigned. The survivors would later remember the serenity and goodness of that friar, who seemed to be filled with a peace that was not of this world. Amid degradation and brutality, Maximilian preserved the dignity of a child of God and treated everyone with respect and love, reminding them by his very presence that not even in Auschwitz could their executioners take their souls from them. The Lord's words were fulfilled in him. Do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Matthew 10:28. In Auschwitz, everything was arranged to tear faith and hope away from the prisoners, reducing them to despair and the mere instinct to survive. And yet Maximilian demonstrated that there is an inner freedom no tyrant can take away, the freedom to love and to believe. The executioners could control his body, but not his soul. They could kill him, but they could not defeat him. That freedom of a child of God was his greatest treasure, and he placed it entirely at the service of others. That heroic charity, lived out day after day, was to culminate in a supreme act. An unexpected event, that summer of 1941, would give Maximilian the opportunity to offer the greatest proof of love, to give his life for another. What he had lived out until then in daily service was to be crowned by total sacrifice. Let us see how that hour came when Maximilian stepped forward to die in the place of a brother. Chapter 9. I will take his place. The supreme offering. A cruel law prevailed at Auschwitz. If a prisoner managed to escape, other prisoners from the same barracks would be sentenced to death in retaliation, as a warning to everyone and to deter further escapes. And so, toward the end of July 1941, a prisoner from Maximilian's barracks disappeared, and it was believed that he had escaped. The retaliation was swift. The officer in charge lined up the prisoners from the barracks and, walking along the rows, pointed out 10 men, chosen almost at random, who would be condemned to die in the most atrocious manner, locked in an underground bunker without food or water until they died of hunger and thirst. The 10 men chosen knew what awaited them, and terror and anguish seized them. Among those selected was a man named Franciscan Gajowniczek. When he heard his sentence, the man began to lament, crying out in anguish that he had a wife and children and would never see them again. His cry, as a distraught father, echoed through the prisoners' terrified silence. And then the unimaginable happened. From among the ranks, a man stepped forward. It was prisoner 16670, the priest Maximilian Kolbe, who calmly approached the officer to ask him for something extraordinary. Maximilian offered to die in place of that family man. He calmly explained that he was a Catholic priest, already elderly, with neither wife nor children, and that he wished to take the place of the man who did have a family. In short, he asked to die so that the other man might live. It was such an unexpected and extraordinary gesture that even the officer was left stunned, unaccustomed as he was to seeing such nobility in that place of horror. Against all custom, the officer accepted the exchange. Franciscan Gajowniczek was returned to the ranks of the living, and Maximilian took his place among the 10 condemned to die of starvation. The priest had given the greatest proof of love, fulfilling to the letter the words of the Lord, "No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." John 15:13. And he did it for a stranger, for just any brother, freely offering himself to death. That gesture embodies all the greatness of Christian holiness. In the place where humanity had fallen lowest, where hatred and cruelty seemed to have devoured everything, the light of the purest love suddenly shone forth. One man dying so that another might live. Maximilian then descended, with the other 9, into the death bunker. But what happened there, far from being mere horror, became a moving testimony of faith and charity. Let us contemplate it with reverence. Chapter 10. The Hunger Bunker. Love in Hell. The 10 condemned men, Maximilian among them, were locked in an underground bunker, a dark cell where they were meant to die slowly of hunger and thirst. It was one of the most atrocious tortures imaginable, devised to spread terror throughout the entire camp. The executioners expected to hear cries of despair, curses, the sounds of men sinking into agony and hatred. But what they heard was very different, For from that death bunker, prayers and hymns began to rise. Maximilian, a priest to the very end, transformed that cell of horror into a place of prayer. He encouraged his companions, consoled them, prayed with them, spoke to them of God, heaven, and the Virgin Mary, and gave them the strength to die in peace and with hope. It is said that those men could be heard praying and singing hymns to the Virgin, as though instead of a prison of death, it were a chapel. Day after day, as their strength ebbed away, Maximilian sustained his companions in agony. He prepared them for death, filled them with comfort and hope, and turned that place of torment into a vestibule of heaven. His presence completely transformed the atmosphere of the bunker. Where despair should have reigned, peace reigned instead. Where hatred sought to triumph, love triumphed. Even the guards were impressed by that serene priest praying in the midst of death. That bunker is perhaps one of the most striking images in Christian history, a place built for despair, transformed by a saint into a temple of prayer. It reminds us that no situation is so dark that the light of God's love cannot shine through, nor any prison so sealed that it can prevent the soul from rising to heaven. Maximilian brought God into the place where God seemed absent, and by doing so, he defeated those who believed they had defeated him. Days passed, and one by one the condemned men died. Maximilian, sustained by supernatural strength, was the last, or one of the last, to hold out, accompanying his companions to the end. When, after about 2 weeks, the executioners wanted to finish off those who were still alive once and for all, they found Maximilian still alive and calm, and, according to witnesses, raising his arm to receive death peacefully. On August 14th, 1941, the eve of the feast of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, Maximilian was executed by an injection of acid, which brought his life to an end. He died in peace, as he had lived, entrusting himself to God and to the Immaculate Virgin. The next day, on the feast of the Assumption, his body was cremated, and his ashes were lost among those of the countless victims of that extermination camp. Thus, the man who, as a child, had asked the Virgin for the white and red crowns completed his offering. His death became one with the immense suffering of the countless victims of Auschwitz, before which the Church and the whole world bow in grief and respect. Yet amid that abyss of evil, Maximilian's figure shines like a light that the darkness could not extinguish, the light of love that conquers hatred, of a man who dies so that another may live. That light did not go out with his death. Instead, it would illuminate the whole world. Let us see how the Church recognized him as a martyr of charity. Chapter 11. Martyr of Charity, Canonization and Legacy. The man for whom Maximilian gave his life, Francis Gajowniczek, survived the horrors of Auschwitz and managed to leave the camp alive when the war ended. He was reunited with his family and lived for many more years, reaching an advanced age. For the rest of his life, he never ceased bearing witness to what Maximilian had done for him, telling everyone who wanted to listen that he had been saved thanks to the sacrifice of that holy priest. The memory of Maximilian and his heroic sacrifice spread throughout the world, moving countless people. The Church examined his life and death and recognized in him a true saint and martyr. In 1971, Pope Paul VI declared him blessed. Years later, in 1982, Pope St. John Paul II, also Polish and devoted to him, solemnly canonized him, enrolling him in the catalogue of the saints before a great multitude, among whom was Gajowniczek himself. It was a moment of profound emotion. That humble man, saved decades earlier by Maximilian's sacrifice, now witnessed the glorification of his Savior before the entire Church. His presence was like a living testimony to the power of love, a family man who had been able to watch his children and grandchildren grow because a saint had died in his place. Rarely has the concrete fruit of a martyr's charity been seen so clearly. At that canonization, John Paul II proclaimed Maximilian Kolbe a martyr of charity. By this title, the Church recognized that Maximilian had died out of love, giving his life for a brother, and that his death, although not exactly like that of the martyrs of old who died for confessing the faith, was a true martyrdom, the total offering of his life out of love for Christ, present in his neighbor. His sacrifice was the supreme fruit of a life devoted entirely to love. From then on, Saint Maximilian Kolbe has been venerated throughout the Church as one of the great saints of the 20th century. He is especially beloved as the patron of causes of great relevance today. He is invoked as a protector of families, prisoners, and the persecuted, of those who work in the media, and as a witness to the value of human life in the face of ideologies that despise it. His feast is celebrated on August 14th, the day of his death. The life and death of Maximilian contain a powerful message for our time. In a century marked by ideologies that sowed hatred, contempt for humanity, and death, he responded with love taken to the extreme, with the dignity of the human person, and with the gift of his life. His witness proclaims that love is stronger than hatred, and that not even the hell of Auschwitz could extinguish the light of charity. This witness offers lessons worth taking to heart. Let us consider them. Chapter 12. Lessons for today. The life of Saint Maximilian. Kolbe contains lessons of great value for us. The first and greatest is that of love taken to the extreme. Maximilian gave his life for a brother, fulfilling the words of the Lord. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. John 15:13. His example reminds us that true love is proven through sacrifice, and that the measure of love is to love without measure, to the complete gift of oneself. He also teaches us that love is stronger than hatred. In the place where evil seemed to have triumphed completely, Maximilian made charity shine forth, overcoming the evil around him with goodness. The words of St. Paul the Apostle were fulfilled in him. Do not be conquered by evil, but conquer evil with good. Romans 12:21. In a world wounded by so many forms of hatred and violence, his witness encourages us to respond to evil with love, the only force that truly transforms. He also teaches us the value and dignity of every human person. Maximilian gave his life for a stranger, for an ordinary man, seeing in him a brother and a child of God. In a century when perverse ideologies despised and annihilated human life, he proclaimed through his sacrifice that every person is infinitely valuable because he or she is loved by God. His example calls us to respect and defend the dignity and life of every human being without exception. He also teaches us the beauty of consecration to the Virgin Mary. Maximilian's entire life was an act of love for the Immaculate, to whom he gave himself completely as her instrument. He shows us that devotion to Mary does not lead us away from Christ, but leads us to him and makes our apostolate fruitful. And he encourages us, like him, to place ourselves under the mantle of the Mother of God, entrusting our lives and works to her for the salvation of souls. And finally, he teaches us that only love is creative, as he himself used to say. Only love truly builds. Only love bears fruit. Only love endures. Without love, everything is sterile. With love, even death becomes fruitful and saving. May Saint Maximilian Kolbe obtain for us a heart capable of loving in this way, with generosity even to the complete gift of self, a love for the Virgin that leads us to Christ, and the courage to overcome evil with good. Let us place ourselves under his protection with a trusting prayer. Chapter 13. Prayer to Saint Maximilian Maria Kolbe, glorious Saint Maximilian. Maria Kolbe, in love with the Immaculate Virgin and martyr of charity at Auschwitz, who gave your life to save a brother, obtain for me a generous and courageous love, capable of giving itself for others and overcoming evil with good. You who, as a child, chose the two crowns, the white crown of purity and the red crown of martyrdom, teach me to live with purity of heart and to be ready to give my life for Christ, serving Him in our suffering brothers and sisters and loving Him above all things. You who consecrated yourself entirely to the Immaculate and worked tirelessly for the salvation of souls, obtain for me a tender and filial love for the Virgin Mary, so that, placing myself under her mantle, I may let her lead me to Jesus and work, according to my strength, for His kingdom. You who, in the hell of Auschwitz, turned a death bunker into a place of prayer and comforted those who were dying alongside you, pray for prisoners, for the persecuted, and for all who suffer injustice and hatred, so that they may find comfort, hope, and peace. Saint Maximilian, patron saint of our difficult times, pray for families, for the defense of life and for the victory of love over hatred in the world. And pray for me who trust in your intercession, so that by loving as you loved, I may deserve to attain with you the glory of heaven, through Christ our Lord. Amen. Saint Maximilian Maria Kolbe, martyr of charity, pray for us.